thank you all for coming on a Sunday morning. It's always difficult to speak about a book that you've already written and it's been published. So it's hard to make a pitch for an argument or, what the book is about. So I'm going to try and do something a little different. I'll try and explain to you what prompted me to write the book in the first place, and perhaps take you through the structure of the book, how the book was conceptualized, what I had in mind when I decided to write a history of business in modern India. And by modern India, my modern India goes to the 1750s. And I also decided to write something about an India that we don't normally think about in the present context, when we have talk about the $1 trillion economy, India on the move, the tiger versus the dragon. So in many ways, a past which was important and central to the making of India's present was often forgotten. So I want to tell you, therefore, why I decided to write the book. So I'll give you the reasons for that. I'll take you through the structure of the book. And I'll also tell you of some of the challenges I faced in writing this book. And the challenges are to do with the method I adopted. The challenges are to do with the kind of sources you need to write about business, not always easy to get to. And also to talk about some of the extraordinary assistance I got from important business houses, notably the business house of Godrej, whom I was involved with in setting up aspects of their archive. So I want to talk about the challenges, I want to talk about the opportunities I got, and then perhaps raise a few questions on what I would do if I were to write this book again, God forbid, but if I were to write this all over again, what I would actually do and what I would include. And it may not quite look like the way it does today. So to sort of set the conversation rolling, I decided to write the book partly after I had offered a course at the undergraduate level to my students in BITS Pilani, Goa, who have to do a compulsory course in the humanities and social sciences as they become engineers. So I decided to offer a course which I call Business and Politics in the 19th and 20th century. And it had a few takers, and many of the students were interested in what this history would look like. And it took them, it took me some time to convince why it was important to think about business in India's past, because for very long we have grown with the idea that India is, and of course was, a predominantly agrarian country and economy, went through centuries of colonial subjugation and exploitation, and that led to a kind of agrarian impoverishment, poverty, drain of wealth. And somehow in that story of decline and redemption, the role of Indian business was missing. If there was any reference to Indian business, it was always about Indian business being collaborators, Indian businessmen quite happy to work as compradors, Indian businessmen willing to hedge their bets constantly, and taking a long time before they decided that they would in fact stand up against the Raj and work with the national movement. So in many ways, the history of Indian business was often erased from conventional accounts. So that was one reason why I thought we needed to bring back the businessman into the history of India. I don't mean the merchant, but I mean the businessman. So that was one pressing rationale for me to write the book. The second rationale, which I thought was sort of equally important, was to think a little bit about the ubiquity of manufactured goods that we all grew up with. I mean, I, born in the 50s, grew up in the 60s, saw my father battle a repressive taxation regime, looked forward to his visits abroad when he would get us imported pleated skirts from Bangkok. And it was a very different era in which I lived and grew. And there was the ubiquity of certain products. So you had the steel almirah, you had the Godrej chair, and there was a way in which we had got used to a particular imagination of India, which historians have called austere modernism. And so it was something that I wanted to capture. I wanted to try and find out what people did, how they thought about business, how they manufactured goods, given the kind of challenges India faced after 1947. And that sort of prompted me to look back and look at the way Indian business groups, coalesced Indian business groups evolved their strategies. Indian business groups thought about manufacture, something that was not easy to do, thought about technology, and that then produced this kind of book that I wanted to write. And I deliberately titled it India Before the Ambanis, not because I spend a lot of time on the Ambanis, I don't. The last chapter is about Dhirubhai Ambani and the Reliance Empire, and for reasons which I will talk about later. But I really wanted to remind readers and remind current generation that there was a very rich and productive period of experimentation in the 19th and 20th century, without which we cannot think about the kinds of business history that we think of today. So that was one of the reasons why I really embarked on the book. The second was, of course, the access I had to some archives. As a historian, I cannot write things from the air. This is not a work of fiction. Some bits of it might seem fictive, but it's not a work of fiction. And I therefore needed to anchor my work within material that I knew was reasonably reliable. I'm not here making any truth claim. I'm not saying that anything I write is particularly objective or unbiased. I try and keep my authorial voice and feelings out of it. But I did need a repository of material to rely upon to write a history of these men that I was trying to track. Now, I was lucky insofar as some business houses today have started not just archiving their material, collecting their material, putting it into a repository, but also making it available to a public. And this, I think, is a very important move. It began, of course, with the Tatas. It's been taken forward by Godrej. There are other families like the Bajaj and the Kirloskars who also come up with very important private papers, but all these archives are quite different. So you would have one company like the Tatas that would try and document everything that the Tatas did. They wanted to keep the documentation of the various subsidiary companies that make up the Tata conglomerate. With Godrej, it was much more a history of objects. So if you go to the Godrej archive, you will be dazzled by the kind of catalogues they have of their actual products and the promotion literature they have of their special chair, the CH5, the typist chair, the Storwell Almira, their safe cabinets. So you really find a history of material objects when you look at an archive like Godrej. If you look at another very important business house of Bajaj, Jamnalal Bajaj, Gandhian, you very interestingly find that the collection is very personal. The collection is all about the man. The collection is about how Jamnalal is so convinced by the Gandhian message that he, of course, cannot give up his business profile. His object is to make money. He cannot, go along with the Mahatma's ideas about modern business. And yet, if you look at the collection that he leaves behind, it's not about the business, it's about him. It's about his personal, reckoning, his philosophy, his extraordinary transformation he undergoes when he meets Gandhi. So it's a very different kind of archive that the Bajaj Heritage Group has given to us. So in many ways, therefore, the fact that there was access to all these kinds of archives, the fact that now business people are actually interested in allowing the public to look at their archive, was also reason enough for me to make a claim, to stake a claim, to write business history, which was evidence-based, which is not hagiographical, which is not the rags to riches stories that you get of conventional biographies, but to try and go and look deeper. So that was the field in which I tried to work. So the questions were clear, what I wanted to ask. The material was there for me to scope out and mine and read and reconstruct. And then, of course, the question was, how would I tell the story? Was I going to tell the story as a period of business strategies, what industries came up, what industries did not, why was cotton so important, why was it replaced by iron and steel, what did planning do to the Indian industry, what did independence do, what was it like before independence. So all these questions were part of a larger context in which I wanted to plot my story. So I thought about it. I wondered whether I should end up writing a history of the business context. And then I decided to take what I call a quasi-biographical approach. So the book is actually about, it says it's about a history of Indian business, which it is, but it's a history of Indian business told through individuals. So I selected individuals who would help me plot the larger story and who would also tell me something about their own individual lives and labor. So it is biographical in the sense that I look at individuals. I look at individuals who decide to take very critical decisions about business, but I also use their lives to reflect on the context in which they lived and labored. Now, of course, in making this selection, I've been quite arbitrary. I could have chosen Tata over Birla. I could have chosen the Sassoons over Godrej. I could have chosen Motilal Seal over Dwarkanath Tagore. I could have chosen somebody else over Jamsetji Jijiboy. I could have chosen someone else over Dhirubhai. So the selection is arbitrary, and I'm not saying that the business history of this period can only be written through these figures. I'm not saying that. I just decided to choose my individual protagonists because at the end of the day, I felt that each of them had something original, something pioneering in the way they took their business to another level. So you could find many also rans, but there were these men whom I chose to sort of focus on were also people who were underrepresented in conventional business history. All of us, and there have been fantastic histories of the Tatas, for example. Some brilliant work. I mean, Rhino's work recently based on the Tata archive is a stupendous achievement. So I did not want to go back on ground that was already tread. I wanted to do something a little different. So I picked up people who have not been talked about so extensively. I also wanted to correct, or shall we say, rectify some asymmetries that have happened in our history of, in our perception of business history of India. We always almost tend to look at Bombay. And legitimately, Bombay was the financial capital of the 19th and 20th century, remains an important hub. And it's not coincidental that all histories talk about the great businessmen of Bombay or Ahmedabad. So that's not, it's quite legitimate. But I also felt that by doing that, I was overlooking other figures who came from, say, southern India, say the TVS brothers. And what is it that they brought to the business field? And also these were men who did not occupationally and in terms of caste location come from business families. There were men who came from completely different backgrounds. So what was it about these men who felt that their ingenuity, their innovative spirit could do business? What was it about the situation in which they felt that they should move into business? So that brought to me the importance, and I think throughout this period, at least for the 19th and the mid-20th century, the importance of the nation as as a factor in their imagination. All these men, particularly from Jamnalal Bajaj, Kirloskar, TVS Iyengar, all of them were really thinking about how to accelerate Indian modernity and what was the role business could play in that transition to modernization. So for me, the biographical sketches are not just about profit making. The biographical sketches are not just about doing wonderfully or having great profit margins. They're also to do with the kind of imagination that these men had, these men deployed, and these men pursued. And that really connects, if you will, a person like Saurabh Godrej, with Jamnalal Bajaj, with Kirloskar. All these men were thinking about the nation that they were planning to build. And what was it that industry could give to the emerging nation? Now, this also meant that they had to have a fairly complex relationship with the state, whether it's the imperial state or the national state. So it brought both the imagination of the nation and the need for thinking about business as a trusteeship, as something that you give to the nation to enable the nation to transition to a kind of industrial modernity. But at the same time, it gives you a very good lens to understand the relationship between a new post-colonial state and a rising nascent business class. What was that relationship? Was it fraught? Was it tense? Was it difficult? And I will suggest to you that this complicated relationship, something that we still see today, is something that's actually built up in this period. So the reason I use Dhirubhai Ambani in the last chapter is precisely because I feel that his life embodies a particular shift in the relation between business and state, and it's a shift that he capitalizes on. It's a shift that becomes also problematic and controversial, but it's a shift that I think persists even today. So there were reasons why I chose these figures. So that is as far as my choice of characters. I thought I'd sort of take you through, if I may, through the book and tell you a little bit more about my protagonists, and before doing that, to add a caveat that while I've tried to humanize the story, while I've tried to look at these businessmen, with lives of their own, with family problems, with issues of, challenges of raising capital for what they were doing, with problems of maintaining reputation when something went bust. I've tried to humanize it, but I have to say that I've tried also as far as possible to keep very personal relations out. These were for two reasons. One is that when you are using an archive of this kind and you choose to, you are using facts that have been given to you by the permission of these families, there has to be certain ethical considerations involved. And this is one of the challenges I find in writing business history. While I can write about the mutiny of 1857 completely the way I wish to interpret the data, when it comes to using sensitive material given to you by business houses, you also have to be a little sensitive about what you can use and what you can't use, for two reasons. One is that you might be violating the confidence of people who've actually given you private letters to share, but also in the times that we live in and the extraordinary pressure that publishers have from the law department. Every line and sentence has to be vetted, and you're asked, will this bring a court case on us? So as a historian, this is a challenge. It's a challenge because one aspect of you wants to write critically, openly, say what you will. On the other hand, you are bound by ethical considerations of protecting the anonymity of people who have given their material in good faith. So there's due diligence. But there is the other larger problem when you have to justify every line to your publisher saying, look, Jamsetji Jijiboy was dead 100 years ago. He is not going to come back and haunt us. But it was not easy to do this because at every point of writing the book, I had to deal with this issue. Okay, so let me take you through the book and my protagonists. The first chapter gives you a broad sort of timeline in which my actors inhabit. It starts from about the 1700s, which is when the Mughal Empire rules India as the centralized entity and has overseen a very impressive economy of trade, banking, manufacture. I mean manufacture, artisanal manufacture. We are not talking about industrial manufacture. It also then takes you through the transition to British colonialism, when the English take over India, subjugate India to the requirements of the metropolitan economy of London, but in the process also expose India to a global economy. So whatever happens in London, whatever happens elsewhere, immediately impacts India. So India really becomes part of, it was already part of an integrated global economy in the Indian Ocean, but now it's a part of a much greater integrated economy, and there are spaces for Indian capital and business to leverage and work alongside in this new dispensation. I then take up the issue of what it is to be a colony in the 19th century. What kind of access do you have to technology transfers? What kind of access do you have to tariff duties and protection? You don't have agency in determining your tariff policy or protectionism. I take you through that in the 19th century. And then I take you through the most important moment for Indian business, which is the interwar period, when Britain is forced to give up her industrial agenda and gives Indian industry a bit of space to start manufacturing for the war effort. So it's that moment which is seen as the high noon of Indian industrial development. That's the period when you have Indian industry is actually given the space within the colonial dispensation to be able to manufacture. This is the period when you have Tata Steel, Birla Jute, all of that is happening. Of course, long before this, there is a strong sense among Indian business groups that we need to go Swadeshi. We need to start doing things on our own. We need to boycott stuff that comes from England. But the real shift happens not in 1905. The real shift happens between 1914 to 35. Those years really, the interwar years, are really the period when Indian industry becomes very important. And there is a real surge in the development of Indian industry. So I give you a timeline of this particular period, which is a complex period, and then briefly take you through what it was like after independence. 1947, when India became independent, what was the state India found herself in? Zero foreign exchange, denied of the foreign exchange reserves that had been promised during the war, and you had to then opt for a particular mode of development that became known and now lambasted as import substitution. You try to substitute imports by doing everything on your own with very little to go by, very little foreign exchange to dip into any technology, and therefore, of course, you are battling in a period of excessive capital and steel shortage. This coincides with the period of development that we now know as planned development, the private-public experiment that the Nehruvian years saw, with the emphasis on heavy industries, steel, try and produce for the nation a particular kind of, shall we say, a socially egalitarian distribution network. And it is in that context that Indian business has to operate. Now, it's very easy now to say that this was excessively regulated, this is terrible, it's a stranglehold of the state, we need deregulation. It was not like that at all. I really try and remind my readers that at this point of time, most of the Indian businessmen who were used to a protectionist imperial state was quite happy with a protectionist national state. The real rot happens when the ruling party really degenerates into factionalism and squabbles, and that infamous license quota permit regime degenerates into what historians call the era of briefcase politics. And that's really the context in which I set up men like Dhirubhai. So the first part, the timeline therefore gives you the context in which this is all happening. And in that timeline, I have chosen certain figures to tell the story. So in many ways, I feel that the individual lives of these men are also indexing the macro history, the larger context that we try and employ in the first section. I do want to say that I also think, in my own naive way, that each of them had something to contribute to the idea of modern business. So I don't think that these men were just, shall we say, I won't call them victims, but subjects of circumstance. I mean, these were men who knew where they were located. These men knew how to work the system. And these men then introduced something quite new in the way they organize their business. And I think that kind of, that to me is pioneering. We are not really talking about productivity here. We are not even talking about efficiency. These catchwords are not really applicable to the kind of story that I'm saying, but I am trying to introduce a new element, which is the idea of social good. The idea of business as a public good, as a public utility. And this is not just employment generation or scale or economies of scale, but to try and see what we can do with business that enables a certain kind of transition to modernization. It could be responsible consumption, like Godrej says. It could be responsible business practices that Tata and Godrej do. It could be a new paternalist form of labor management that all of them do. But then not to whitewash everything and argue that all these men had no problems with labor. So I don't do that either. I try and identify those instances that these men come up with that do make them, in many ways, pioneers. So just to go through a quick sense of my protagonists, these are for the period of transition from Mughal India to British India. I choose a Gujarati banker who actually is credited with bankrolling the colonial conquest. And this is to indicate to you that the state that comes into being, the colonial state, has very strong Indian allies. And the decision of Indian bankers to bankroll the English rather than the Marathas, who were the other contender, was very simple. It was a business decision. The decision was the English had money in their coffers, the English repaid their loans, so we would rather stay with the man who repaid our loans. So it was a very pragmatic decision, and there's no point trying to read our present concerns into the past and say whether Tarwadi was patriotic or not. It doesn't enter the picture. He is a hard businessman. He's dealing with a complex political situation. He needs to hedge his bets, and he supports the company. The company is also English East India Company. It's also interested in protecting individual property rights. And in this context, you have a man like Tarwadi who bankrolls the company conquest. So that's my first protagonist. What I do in the chapter is to talk about the complex relation and the fact that he was able to really get the company to satisfy his terms. So we are really not talking about an unequal partnership. We are actually talking about a very complex relationship between two actors in the making of British India. I then follow it up with the rise of two important colonial cities, Bombay and Calcutta, on either side of the seaboards of India, and I look at two protagonists. I look at Jamsetji Jijiboy in Bombay, the great Parsi magnate, responsible for the, dominated the opium trade with China, and on the eastern side I have Dwarkanath Tagore, the great-grandfather of Rabindranath Tagore, and who was actually an extraordinarily pioneering businessman. So these were two figures that I found especially interesting. Good work has happened on them, but I still thought it was important to bring them as a study in contrast. Study in contrast because Jamsetji comes from an artisanal transitioning to commercial background, moves into Bombay from Navsari, very quickly takes on the He takes on the atmosphere in Bombay city, which is rife with opportunity. You have European private traders, you have Gujaratis who are all trading in opium, in cotton, and he realizes that money is to be made in opium and strikes very unusual friendships with Englishmen with whom then he enters a big agency business. Now, this is the point of comparison with Dwarkanath, who also in Bengal comes from an agrarian gentry background, but who has excellent expertise in the legal management of agrarian disputes, which brings him quite close to Englishmen. So there is, in both cases, an English connection that enables them to dabble in new forms of business organization. As far as Jamsetji is concerned, he's able to trade with England. He builds some fine ships. His agents are there in London, involved in the remittance business. He runs his trade with London and Canton. While with Dwarkanath, he learns from the English the principles of the first managing agency and the joint stock company. So I do feel that these figures are to be thought about seriously, because I think they bring something new to the way in which capital and finance is to be organized. Of course, there is also a contrast. Jamsetji does very well, leaves behind a huge estate, and that estate is deployed into initial investment in textile manufacture in Bombay by the Parsis, while in Calcutta, there's a huge crash following Dwarkanath's speculation, and the Bengali upper caste businessman retreats from business, goes to employment. Never comes back to business until 1905. So there is an interesting story to be told of the kind of groups that were involved in the business. The third chapter really takes you through, there is one chapter in between all of this, which is an abstract entity that I call the bazaar. The bazaar is really, for me, the precursor to the informal sector that we all talk about today. We all talk about formal sector being small, the informal sector being large. So I look at the origins of that informal sector and how it is conducting operations on an immense scale. So that was a chapter which, for me, the bazaar itself is the protagonist. That is the actor. It doesn't have individual merchants, so to speak. Then the remaining chapters talk about two important families. I talk about the TVS Sundaramayangar family, who entered into a very different kind of, they are dabbling in electricity, they are dabbling in electrification, and along with that, the Kirloskars, who look at agricultural pumps, who want to think about radically improving the agricultural sector. That will then push India into a different kind of industrial scenario. So the story of the agricultural pump, the story of the Kirloskar pump, the story of the Kirloskar family, the story of then the Bajaj, who then decides to take on transport, and the scooter, and how these families make their choices. And it's interesting to see because, as I said, I was quite fortunate in having access to the correspondence of Jamnalal Bajaj and Kamal Nayan Bajaj, and also the correspondence of course, Rahul Bajaj, and why he chose to take the humble scooter and make it the mode of mass transport for Indians in the Nehruvian period. So I do that. I also take a bit of time in each of these chapters to talk about the challenges they faced in a period of the planned economy. The fact that you had to manufacture with steel shortage, you had to manufacture with extremely difficult access to technology, you had to run around to the bureaucracy to get every permission. So the frustration of the businessmen and how they overcome this is also part of the story I write. Finally, I come to Dhirubhai Ambani because I really felt that he inaugurates a very different period in Indian business. And I'm not, he really exploits the system of the license permit quota Raj through the 1970s and very, very effectively. But something happens in the 80s when he decides to really introduce a complete change in the way in which he wants to raise capital. So he is generally known as the equity cult is something that he sponsors. He gets small investors, medium level investors to invest in his shares of the company that he builds. And in many ways, I feel he managed to strike at the pulse of the aspiring Indian middle class. So, Dhirubhai Ambani's story is a story to be thought of. It's not easy to tell the story because it's either you have cinematic representation like the Guru, or you have very hagiographical work, or you have very critical reportage because he ran into several controversies and you had the Indian Express run a strong campaign against him. So he's a very polarizing individual. So to write about him in this story was a bit of a challenge. But I do feel that in telling the story, and I hope some of you will read it, in telling the story, I think you can get a sense of the rapidly changing context in which business comes into being, in which the share market becomes much more important, in which top of the line modernized factories are being instituted in Naroda, the Reliance textile, and a complete sea change in consumption habits. So from cotton of Mafatlal to polyester of only Vimal, we actually are moving very, very different. We're actually indexing a transformation in the middle class. So this story is as much also about the middle class consumer of these goods as it is about the businessman. I have a small epilogue where I chose to write about the state, which is, of course, the big actor. You know, conventional business history, particularly business history of the United States, would never have the state in their histories. You know, it's something that you keep well apart. In India, I argue that you cannot really understand Indian business, whether of Arjunji, my first Gujarati banker, or Dhirubhai, without understanding the nature of the state. So I write a short epilogue on this fraught relationship between state and business. We keep talking about the nexus between business and politics and how we can start maybe reconceptualizing this complex relationship. So I'll stop there.